Shaq was enjoying a peaceful afternoon at the park when a group of wealthy women sneered. "He looks suspicious. Should we call the cops?" Moments later, sirens wailed, people froze, and cameras started rolling. But instead of reacting with anger, Shaq simply smiled, because he was 5 steps ahead. What happened next turned their smug confidence into sheer humiliation, left the entire park stunned, and sent the internet into a frenzy. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Shaq sat comfortably on a park bench, his massive frame relaxed as he enjoyed the warm afternoon sun. A bag of bird seed rested beside him, and every so often, he tossed a handful onto the pavement, watching as pigeons eagerly gathered around his feet. It was a peaceful moment, one of those rare times when he could just be himself, away from the cameras, the attention, and the noise of the outside world. He wore simple gray sweatpants, a hoodie, and dark sunglasses, blending in like any other visitor looking to unwind. A few feet away, three well-dressed women sat at a picnic table, their conversation lively, until one of them suddenly stiffened. Linda, the self-appointed leader of the group, nudged her friend Debbie and gestured toward Shaq with a sharp tilt of her chin. "Look at that guy over there," she murmured, lowering her voice. "What do you think he's doing here?" Debbie followed her gaze, squinting as if trying to analyze a crime scene. "I don't know," she muttered, "but he doesn't look like he belongs." Susan, the third woman, pursed her lips. "People like that don't usually come to this park." Their words dripped with a quiet, insidious prejudice. They weren't concerned about anything Shaq was actually doing, because he wasn't doing anything at all. He was just sitting there, minding his business. But that wasn't enough. Not for them. Linda huffed, folding her arms tightly. "We should do something. What if he's watching the kids?" Debbie's eyes widened slightly as if the thought had just occurred to her. "Oh God, can you imagine?" Shaq, still unaware of their growing paranoia, leaned back against the bench and stretched his arms. The movement was casual, lazy, completely harmless. But to the Karens, it was confirmation. Linda gasped quietly. "Oh no, he's getting up!" That was it. That was enough for them to decide he was a threat. Debbie's hand flew into her purse, pulling out her phone in one swift motion. Her fingers moved frantically across the screen. "We need the police," she hissed, her voice laced with urgency. "Now!" Susan nodded in agreement, her hands trembling in exaggerated fear. As Debbie pressed the call button, the three women exchanged smug glances, already convinced they had done the right thing. They didn't know it yet, but their little plan was about to backfire in the worst way possible. Debbie gripped her phone tightly, her pulse racing, not from fear, but from the thrill of taking control. She pressed the emergency dial and brought the phone to her ear, her voice immediately shifting into a breathy, exaggerated panic. "911, what's your emergency?" The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. Debbie sucked in a sharp breath. "There's a huge man acting suspicious in the park," she said, forcing a tremor into her voice. "He looks dangerous." The operator remained steady. "Can you describe what he's doing that seems dangerous, ma'am?" Linda leaned in, whispering, "Make it sound worse." Debbie nodded, her grip tightening. "He's loitering, watching people." She turned to Susan for backup. Susan jumped in. "He keeps shifting around like he's looking for something, or someone." In reality, Shaq was sitting completely still, his head tilted down as he casually scrolled through his phone. The only movement was the occasional flick of his thumb against the screen. The dispatcher hesitated. "Has he threatened you in any way?" Linda rolled her eyes and waved her hand impatiently. Debbie quickly took the cue. "Well, not yet," she admitted, then added dramatically, "But you never know with these types of people." Susan placed a hand on Debbie's arm. "Tell them there are kids around," she whispered. Debbie's lips curled slightly. "There are children playing nearby," she stressed, her voice rising an octave. "Please, just send someone before something happens." The dispatcher sighed. "All right, officers are on their way." Debbie's expression immediately shifted to satisfaction. She ended the call and glanced at the other women, a smirk creeping onto her lips. Linda exhaled with relief. "That should take care of it." Susan folded her arms. "They'll probably just ask him a few questions and make him leave." Debbie scoffed. "Good. Maybe next time, people like him will think twice before creeping around our park." Unaware of the trouble brewing, Shaq finally looked up from his phone, stretching his arms before leaning back against the bench. He took a deep breath, enjoying the fresh air. Then sirens. A pair of police cruisers appeared at the entrance of the park, lights flashing, engines roaring. The piercing wail of the sirens shattered the peaceful afternoon, sending flocks of birds scattering into the sky. Shaq lowered his sunglasses and blinked. Well, damn. Around him, heads turned. Parents pulled their kids closer. Joggers paused mid-stride. A few teenagers even pulled out their phones, sensing something about to go down. The Karens, on the other hand, exchanged knowing glances, their smirks deepening. Debbie folded her arms. Showtime! The first squad car came to a stop, and the driver's door swung open. A uniformed officer stepped out, resting a hand on his holster. His eyes locked onto Shaq. Officer Daniels takes a slow step forward. Sir, we need to talk. The sudden flash of red and blue lights reflected off the nearby park benches, casting an eerie glow across the pavement. The sound of screeching tires and slamming car doors broke through the peaceful afternoon, turning heads as families, joggers, and dog walkers paused to take in the scene. Shaq, still seated comfortably on the bench, finally lifted his head from his phone. His sunglasses slid down the bridge of his nose just enough for him to glance over them. He watched as not one, but two patrol cars rolled to a stop just feet away from him. His first instinct wasn't fear. It was amusement. A few kids playing basketball nearby stopped dribbling, eyes wide as they looked between Shaq and the approaching officers. Parents clutched their children's hands a little tighter. A teenager perched on a bike discreetly raised his phone, hitting record. The energy in the park shifted, curious murmurs growing as people tried to figure out what was happening. Across the grass, the Karens stood together, heads held high, whispering to each other with triumphant smirks. Linda folded her arms, her eyes gleaming with self-satisfaction. See? She whispered to Debbie. They know something's off about him, too. Shaq exhaled through his nose, adjusting his posture slightly, but making no move to get up. Instead, he leaned back on the bench, stretching his long arms over the backrest, his expression unreadable. The first officer, a tall, serious-looking man with sharp features, stepped out of his squad car. His name tag read, Daniels. He placed a cautious hand on his holster, his other hand resting on his belt, as he took a few measured steps forward. Sir, Daniels said, his voice firm but professional. We need to talk. Shaq didn't move. He simply tilted his head, the corners of his mouth twitching upward into the faintest smirk. Oh, he said, adjusting his sunglasses and leaning forward slightly. This is about to get interesting. Daniels glances back at the patrol car as another officer steps out. Officer Daniels stood firm, his stance professional but cautious as he met Shaq's gaze. The tension in the air was thick, the weight of countless assumptions pressing down on the moment. Around them, the park had gone nearly silent, save for the occasional murmur or rustling of leaves. People were watching, some curious, some concerned, and a few recording with their phones. Shaq, however, showed no signs of distress. If anything, he looked amused. With a slow exhale, he leaned back on the bench, his massive frame relaxed as if this were just another ordinary day. Daniels cleared his throat, breaking the silence. Sir, we got a report about suspicious behavior. Shaq cocked his head, feigning confusion. Suspicious? He repeated. From who? Before Daniels could answer, movement to the side caught Shaq's attention. The three Karens, Linda, Debbie, and Susan, stepped forward, their expressions a mix of entitlement and self-righteousness. Linda, the apparent ringleader, squared her shoulders. We just didn't feel safe, she declared, her voice carrying through the park. This park is for families. Shaq slowly removed his sunglasses, revealing his piercing gaze. Lady, I am family, he said, his voice deep and steady. I got 6 kids. A few people in the growing crowd chuckled. Someone muttered, she really messed up. Debbie, undeterred, crossed her arms. That doesn't mean you belong here, she snapped. There are rules for a reason. Shaq let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Rules, he mused. Didn't see a no Shaq's allowed sign on my way in. Daniel sighed, clearly realizing the situation was spiraling into something bigger than he had anticipated. He turned back to Shaq, his expression neutral. Sir, I need to see some ID. Shaq held his gaze for a moment, then, without breaking eye contact, reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He moved slowly, deliberately, letting the moment drag out. The Karens looked smug, convinced they had the upper hand. He flipped open his wallet and pulled out his driver's license, holding it between 2 fingers. Just as he was about to hand it over, The sound of another engine approaching made heads turn. A second patrol car pulled into the park, but this one was different. It wasn't a regular squad car. It was a sleek, black, unmarked vehicle. The crowd murmured in anticipation. Something was about to shift. The car door swung open, and a high-ranking officer stepped out. The second police car rolled to a smooth stop, its glossy black exterior gleaming under the afternoon sun. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder as people exchanged curious glances, unsure of what to expect. The Karens, still standing smugly in their self-righteousness, straightened their postures, assuming backup had arrived to deal with the problem they had reported. Then the driver's side door swung open. A tall, commanding black man in full uniform stepped out, his presence radiating authority. His posture was straight, his movements deliberate, exuding the kind of confidence that came from years of experience. His badge gleamed under the sunlight, the nameplate above it reading, Chief Reynolds. The moment his polished black boots hit the pavement, the entire energy of the park shifted. The Karens blinked in confusion. Linda whispered, "Who is that?" While Debbie glanced at Susan, hoping she had an answer. But it was Shaq who immediately recognized the man, and so did Chief Reynolds. The instant Reynolds' gaze landed on Shaq, a huge grin spread across his face. The tension in his shoulders melted away, replaced by sheer amusement. Then in a moment that made the Karen's jaws drop, the chief suddenly threw his head back and let out a booming laugh. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," he chuckled, shaking his head. "They really called the cops on you?" Shaq smirked, standing to his full height. "Man, I was just trying to feed some birds." Reynolds took a step closer, ignoring the bewildered expressions on the Karen's faces. With an easy familiarity, he reached out his hand, and Shaq instantly clasped it, pulling him in for a classic dap-up and half-hug. The Karen's confusion twisted into sheer disbelief. Reynolds shook his head, still grinning. "Man, long time no see. How you been, big guy?" The smug expressions on the Karen's faces vanished in an instant. Their confidence drained like water through a sieve as Chief Reynolds stood there, shaking Shaq's hand with a grin that said they were more than just acquaintances. Linda's lips parted slightly, her brain working overtime to process what she was witnessing. Debbie clutched her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. Susan swallowed hard, shifting uncomfortably as the chief's laughter echoed through the park. You know him?" Debbie finally stammered, her voice cracking. Chief Reynolds turned toward them slowly, the warmth in his face vanishing as he fixed them with a piercing stare. His posture shifted, his easygoing demeanor giving way to the commanding presence of a law enforcement officer. "Oh, I don't just know him," Reynolds said, his voice laced with disbelief. "I've known this man for years." He turned back to Shaq. "Tell me they didn't actually—" Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh yeah, man, they really did." Reynolds exhaled sharply and pinched the bridge of his nose. Then, fixing the Karens with a gaze so sharp it could cut glass, he took a step toward them. "Let me get this straight," he said slowly, his voice now dangerously calm. "You saw a black man sitting in a park, minding his own business, and your first instinct was to call the police?" The Karen stiffened. Susan spoke up first, her voice high-pitched and defensive. We just thought something was off. He's big, and we didn't know what he was doing here." Reynolds' expression darkened. "You mean you didn't like that he was here?" he corrected. "You profiled him, assumed he didn't belong, and lied to 911. The Karens fumbled for words, but nothing coherent came out. The crowd that had gathered around them wasn't silent anymore. Whispering turned into hushed chuckles. A few people pulled out their phones. Someone muttered, "Unbelievable." Another voice murmured, "This is too good." Linda's face flushed red as she realized they were becoming the spectacle. Reynolds looked back at Shaq, shaking his head in disgust. "Shaq, man, I'm so sorry you had to deal with this nonsense." Shaq, still grinning, shrugged. "Happens more than you'd think." Reynolds turned back to the Karens, his face now unreadable. "Well, ladies, let's talk about what happens when you waste police resources." Linda's breath hitched as the weight of the situation fully settled on her. She scanned the growing crowd, her face turning ghostly pale as more phones were raised, capturing every second of this unraveling disaster. Debbie clutched her purse tightly, her fingers trembling as she tried to compose herself. Susan, standing slightly behind them, seemed frozen in place, her eyes darting between Shaq and Chief Reynolds as if hoping for some kind of escape route. Then a child's excited voice cut through the thick tension like a knife. "Mom, it's Shaq!" A little boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, pointing directly at the towering man they had just accused of being a threat. The mother gasped in recognition, her expression shifting from curiosity to horror as she realized what had just happened. More whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. "Wait, Shaquille O'Neal? They called the cops on Shaq? Man, this is gonna be all over the internet." Linda's heart pounded as her worst fear became reality. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a public spectacle. Her voice wavered as she tried to salvage what little dignity she had left. We just thought," she started, forcing an uneasy laugh. "We didn't mean any harm. We were just looking out for the community." Reynolds scoffed, crossing his arms. "Number? You just thought a black man in a nice park didn't belong?" His words were slow and deliberate, each one hitting like a hammer. Debbie's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, her hands shaking as she clutched her phone. "This is ridiculous. We're good people. We were just being cautious." Reynolds' stare hardened. Cautious about what? A man sitting on a bench? A man texting on his phone? Or was it just that he didn't look like you? Silence. The Karens had nothing left to say. Shaq, who had been watching with an amused smirk, finally took a step forward. He tilted his head slightly, folding his massive arms across his chest, his towering frame making the three women look even smaller than they already felt. "You know," he said, his deep voice calm but commanding, "I think these ladies owe me an apology." The Karens stiffened as all eyes turned to them, waiting. Linda's lips parted in shock, her face drained of color. Debbie clutched her handbag as if it might somehow shield her from the weight of the moment. Susan, usually the most composed of the three, let out a sharp breath, her fingers gripping the sides of her blazer. Chief Reynolds took a slow, deliberate step forward, his presence looming over them. His deep voice cut through the tension like a blade. "You made a false police report. That's illegal." Debbie sucked in a breath. "Illegal? We were just what?" Reynolds interrupted, his tone sharp. "Wasting police resources? Lying to dispatch? Racial profiling?" He shook his head, looking disgusted. "This is exactly why we have laws against false accusations. You don't get to call 911 just because someone makes you uncomfortable." Linda's legs wobbled beneath her. The murmurs of the growing crowd sent panic crawling up her spine. People were recording. The entire town would know about this. Shaq stepped forward, his sheer size making them shrink back. He tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "So," he said, his voice dangerously calm, "we doing this the easy way or the hard way?" Susan's breath hitched. What does that mean?" Reynolds crossed his arms. "It means either you apologize, loud and clear, on camera, or I slap you with a false report charge. And trust me, that's not something you want on your record." Debbie's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. The reality of the situation crashed down on her all at once. There was no way out of this. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Oh, we'll apologize." Shaq smirked. "Good, but make sure they hear you." Linda's face turned bright red as she struggled to lift her gaze. The weight of humiliation pressed down on her shoulders, making it nearly impossible to speak. Around her, the park had fallen into an eerie silence, save for the occasional murmur from onlookers who had stopped what they were doing to witness the spectacle. Some people had their phones out, recording every second of the moment that would undoubtedly live forever on the internet. Debbie swallowed hard, her voice barely escaping her throat. We misjudged the situation." Shaq, standing tall, with his arms crossed, raised an eyebrow. His expression was unreadable, but there was a clear expectation in his posture. "Sorry, what was that?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "I don't think the people in the back heard you." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered, "They should say it louder." Another voice added, "Own it." Susan, standing beside Debbie and Linda, shifted uncomfortably, folding her arms over her chest as if it could shield her from the collective judgment of the crowd. "We were wrong," she forced out through clenched teeth, her voice barely audible. Shaq exhaled sharply through his nose, unimpressed. "Wrong about what?" Debbie's throat bobbed as she swallowed, clearly struggling to push down the lump of pride that threatened to choke her. She hesitated for a long moment, her eyes darting toward Chief Reynolds as if searching for an escape. But his stern expression offered no way out. Linda, Her lips pursed so tightly the ee almost disappeared, finally forced the words out. We were wrong to assume things about you. Her voice was barely above a whisper, each word dragging out as if it physically pained her to say them. We should not have called the police. Chief Reynolds took a step forward, his arms still folded, his face unreadable. That's right, he said, his voice firm and unwavering. You wasted our time. You wasted his time. And worst of all, you showed the world exactly who you are. Linda flinched at his words, her nails digging into the skin of her palm, as if trying to physically restrain herself from lashing out. She glanced toward the camera still recording, as if realizing, perhaps too late, that no amount of damage control would save her from the inevitable backlash. The crowd continued to murmur, some shaking their heads, others outright glaring at the three women. A teenage girl standing nearby muttered, "They should be embarrassed." Shaq let out a slow exhale before shaking his head, a mix of amusement and disappointment flickering across his face. "See? This is the real problem," he said, his voice even but firm. "You didn't just misjudge me. You assumed the worst the second you saw me sitting here, minding my business. And that's not some innocent mistake. That's not an oops, my bad. That's who you are." Debbie opened her mouth as if to argue, but before she could get a single word out, Chief Reynolds lifted a hand to silence her. His smirk returned, though there was no warmth behind it. "Oh," he said, his voice laced with something unsettlingly final. "And one more thing." Reynolds locked eyes with them, his smirk widening slightly. "You're not getting off that easy." Linda's jaw tightened as she processed the words that had just left Chief Reynolds' mouth. The other two Karens, Debbie and Susan, stiffened beside her, their discomfort visible in the way their hands twitched, as if itching to grab their phones and call someone, anyone, to get them out of this. Reynolds, unfazed by their stunned silence, continued, his voice unwavering. "Since y'all clearly have a problem with black people minding their business in public spaces, maybe it's time you actually do something to support a black community." Debbie scoffed, crossing her arms tightly. "You can't be serious," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, I'm dead serious," Reynolds shot back, his gaze locking onto hers. "False police reports are a crime. Wasting our resources is a crime. But instead of dragging you down to the station, I figured this might actually teach you something." Shaq chuckled under his breath, shaking his head as he watched their growing discomfort. "Man, this is better than any apology they could have given," he muttered. The crowd had begun murmuring again, but this time the energy was different. People were nodding, whispering in agreement. Some even smirked, watching the Karens squirm. Susan, the most visibly shaken of the three, swallowed hard. "What exactly do you mean by community work?" Reynolds smirked. "Glad you asked. There's a black-owned youth center on the south side of town, Unity Rising. They work with underprivileged kids, mentor them, help them stay out of trouble. Real community heroes. And guess what? They could use some extra hands." Linda's face paled. "You want us to?" "That's right," Reynolds cut in smoothly. "For the next 3 months, you'll be volunteering there, cleaning floors, serving meals, organizing donations, whatever they need." He crossed his arms. "Y'all wanted to act like you were in charge, calling the cops on innocent people? Let's see how you handle actually giving back to a community you clearly know nothing about." Debbie's lip curled in disgust. "This is ridiculous. We didn't do anything wrong." Shaq let out a deep, slow laugh. "You didn't do anything wrong?" He leaned forward slightly. "Lady, you tried to have me arrested for sitting on a bench. You lied to the police, wasted their time, and embarrassed yourselves in front of the whole world." He gestured around the park, where multiple people still had their phones raised, recording. Susan's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "We don't belong in some ghetto charity center," she muttered. The second the words left her mouth, the entire park went silent. Even her friends looked horrified. Chief Reynolds took a slow step toward her, his voice dropping into something cold. "You want to repeat that?" Susan's lips trembled, realizing her mistake too late. "Didn't think so," Reynolds muttered, shaking his head. "But that attitude right there? That's exactly why you need this lesson." Linda exhaled sharply, looking around for an escape. This is humiliation. We shouldn't have to." Reynolds held up a hand. "It's either this, or I take you three down to the station right now and book you for filing a false police report. Your choice." The three women exchanged nervous glances. They could feel the weight of the Crowd's judgment, the whispers, the smirks. Susan gritted her teeth. Fine, she muttered through clenched teeth. What was that? Reynolds asked, cupping a hand to his ear. Fine, Debbie echoed, scowling. We'll do the stupid community service. The Karens had no idea what they had just agreed to. But the second they stepped into the youth center, reality was going to hit them hard. The internet had a way of ensuring that justice was served, especially when it came to public humiliation. Within hours of the park incident, the video had exploded across social media, racking up millions of views under the hashtag number Karen versus Shaq. It wasn't just a local scandal anymore. It was everywhere. News outlets picked it up, influencers weighed in, and even late-night talk show hosts had a field day mocking the three women who had tried and failed to get Shaquille O'Neal arrested for simply existing in a park. Linda, Debbie, and Susan became the faces of modern-day racial profiling, and the consequences came swiftly. First, they were shunned socially. Once they had been the self-appointed queens of their gated community, the ones who dictated which families got invited to the Oak Ridge Country Club Gala and who got left off the list. Now, they were the ones being avoided. Women they had once considered friends suddenly stopped answering their calls. Neighbors who had smiled at them in passing now looked the other way. Then the real damage hit. Debbie, who had worked as a high-end real estate agent, lost multiple clients overnight. One of her biggest deals, an $8 million estate, fell through when the buyer emailed her brokerage saying, "I refuse to work with a known racist." A week later, Debbie was quietly fired. Linda's husband, a well-known attorney, was forced to release a public statement distancing himself from her actions. "My wife's behavior does not reflect my values," he wrote, though sources later claimed he was furious behind closed doors. Susan's humiliation, however, was the most ironic of all. A month later, a viral TikTok captured Susan scrubbing graffiti off the walls of the very same youth center she had mocked, and the internet was loving every second of it. The scorching afternoon sun bore down on the pavement as the three women, once pristine and self-righteous, stood in matching blue volunteer vests, scrubbing away at a graffiti-covered wall. Their hands, now stained with streaks of red and black paint, moved mechanically as they worked, but their expressions showed nothing but resentment. Susan winced as she wiped sweat from her brow, glancing around to make sure no one she knew was watching. Debbie, her arms sore from scrubbing, muttered under her breath, "This is humiliating." Linda, still fuming from the public backlash, threw down her sponge. "I can't believe we have to do this. We were just trying to keep our neighborhood safe, and now we're being treated like criminals." Before either of them could respond, a shadow loomed over them. A tall, unmistakable figure had stepped onto the sidewalk, watching them with his arms crossed. Shaquille O'Neal. The women stiffened immediately. Susan lowered her gaze, her face turning bright red, while Debbie froze in place. Linda, always the boldest of the three, forced a weak smile. "Oh, Mr. O'Neal, we, didn't expect to see you here," Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, funny how life works." His voice was calm, but there was amusement in his eyes. He looked at the half-cleaned wall and then back at them. "Y'all missed a spot." Susan clenched her jaw, gripping her sponge so tightly her knuckles turned white. Debbie let out a small, awkward laugh, as if hoping to ease the tension, but Shaq wasn't done. "You know," he continued, his voice carrying a weight that made all three of them listen, "the world would be a lot easier if people just minded their own business." A tense silence followed. Linda opened her mouth, but no words came out. The realization hit them all at once. They had lost their reputations, their dignity, and now their pride. Shaq let the moment linger before smirking. "Anyway, good luck with all this." He turned to leave, but stopped a few steps away. "Oh, and next time, maybe think twice before calling the cops on someone who's just trying to enjoy his day." Without another word, he high-fived Chief Reynolds, who had been watching the whole exchange with a satisfied grin, and walked off. The internet would never let the Karens forget this day, and neither would they.